I wanted to discuss a little bit what studying politics is all about. What is politics, what is political science, and how to measure politics. What is politics? Well, that's a good question. Politics helps social organization. It's about the distribution of benefits and public goods. Public goods are the resources that are present in a political system where use by one individual should not affect use by another. Now, the question is, how can politics affect that? Who decides who gets what and when and where? Should government deliver transit, law enforcement, healthcare, and how? So common themes all around in politics will be values, because the values determine how resources should be divided. And there's always a division and struggle around how resources should be handled and who should handle them. Conflict and resolution. How do we resolve conflicts when conflicts happen? Because conflicts will happen. And decision making. The formal process of making a decision will have a great deal of impact on what kind of outcome that comes out of the decision-making process. And politics exists on so many different levels. Locally, you can talk about where hockey rinks should be built, or internationally, there could be talk about how to create an international body to regulate peace. You can even have politics in your local community association, in a sports team. It's really everywhere. So, as political scientists, we track power. We study institutions, decision-making, and even the power of language in how it affects language. So politics, then, we can define as the authoritative distribution of values in society. But how do we measure politics? That's difficult. Political science as a discipline is part of the social sciences. We are related to sociology and economy, but our focus on power makes us a bit distinguished from both of them, even though we do get inspiration from sociology and economy, and we use some of their methods too when needed. Political analysis has been done since antiquity. As a formal discipline, it emerged in Europe and the US in the late 1800s. But what we're studying are social things, early abstractions. They're things that happen between people. You can't put power under a microscope. So physicists kind of have it easy. They can look at atoms and stars and things like that with using all sorts of tools because they're physical. We are looking at things that happen between people. So we are using things like operative terms, definitions, key concepts, theoretical and analytical frameworks, and yes, I put facts in there. The difficulty is to arrive at what a fact really is. So questions then that political scientists will ask include: who has power? What do governments do? What do citizens want? How do individuals and groups participate? How is wealth distributed? All of these questions will be asked. And we try to use the scientific method, of course. The tricky bit here is that there are two key components: validity and reliability. Validity is a measure of how representative the material is and of what we actually want to study. Are we looking at what we want to look at? So, did we capture what actually happens? Reliability speaks more about the trustworthiness of the process, which has implications for the rigor of the analysis. And it's often a trade-off between these two because as we are working with abstractions and we don't have a lab, we have to look at what happens around us in society, and it makes it much harder to isolate variables. So we have different ways of gathering and making sense of data, different scientific tools. Some are quantitative methods: statistics, surveys, organizational charts, diagrams, and tables. They have strong reliability because they manage to capture big numbers. But they have limited validity because they might not always capture exactly what we want to capture. So that's the tricky bit, to translate what happens with big data down to what happens in everyday life. And that's harder to do with big data than it is with a method like qualitative methods, where you're going out and you're doing an in-depth interview, and then you can get a much more nuanced reply than you can with, say, a survey. The tricky bit with the in-depth interview and that kind of method is that while you can get more nuance than you can in, say, a survey, it's very hard to scale up. So you can do maybe 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 interviews, but when you come to numbers like tens of thousands and millions of people, it's just not easy to translate. So you get higher validity with qualitative methods, but you get lower reliability very often. And then, of course, you have the deductive method, using logical deduction to draw conclusions, which is very often a significant tool in the box. Using this, you can first build theory, and then you can make observations. And that's an introduction to the study of politics, focusing on values and power, and the tools of our trade: statistics or interviews,